It's nice to see at least all of your virtual faces. As Sean said, I'm Ted LaGrange, a wetland program manager for the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. And what I'm going to cover today on the saline wetlands is kind of where they're at, their geographic setting, how they function, talk about their early history, because I'm talking about the historical perspective of saline wetlands, talk a little bit how they've been altered over the years, cover the benefits, and then just mention briefly the conservation actions that are being taken. And some of the other speakers are going to address that in much greater detail. So first, a little bit about myself. We're supposed to introduce ourselves. So I think you could say maybe I have an affinity to corn. I grew up in Iowa, the tall corn state, and actually did my master's work on water birds using seasonally flooded ag fields like cornfields. And then in 1993, I moved to Nebraska, the Cornhusker state. I'm not in that picture, by the way, so that is not me. It's just, off the web. But work with obviously a lot of wetlands that are being impacted by agriculture, including corn, places like the rainwater basins and many of our playa wetlands. But Nebraska is also blessed with an amazing diversity of wetlands, many of which are not surrounded by corn and are quite intact and really amazing resources throughout the state. And again, in my job, I work statewide with all the different wetland types in Nebraska. I hardly ever give a talk without showing this map. This map was from 2005. The Guide to Nebraska Wetlands was put together, kind of showing where some of our major wetland complexes are. And you can see the eastern saline wetlands that I'll be talking about down in the Lancaster County, Saunders County area. But we have an amazing diversity of wetlands, again, across the state that I work in. And the wetland complex map actually just barely predated the legacy plan and the biologically unique landscapes, but there's a lot of overlap. So here in blue, that wetland complex map, and in green are many of the biologically unique landscapes that have a lot of wetland resources in them. All of them have some wetlands, but here I'm highlighting in green the ones that have a lot of wetland resources in them. And just the last slide about my background, I work collaboratively with lots of partners throughout the state in many of the different biologically unique landscapes, from the Sandhills to the Central Platte to the Rainwater Basin and the Missouri River. And so have the opportunity to work with Legacy and many different partners throughout Nebraska. So now let's shift and focus in on the wetlands, the eastern saline wetlands in Lancaster and Saunders County. So this map is showing that complex boundary in green, and then the purple line there is the actual biologically unique landscape boundary for the saline wetlands, BUL. And so you can see it follows Salt Creek and the tributaries to Salt Creek, again through mostly Lancaster, a little bit of southern Saunders counties. And this map shows where the saline wetlands and soils are located in white appropriately for saline wetlands. And so you can see the distribution of those wetlands along the floodplains of these streams. And historically, it's hard to know how many wetlands we had historically. The estimate gets thrown around about 20,000 acres. So it was always a small wetland complex and very geographically restricted, but also very unique. And I'll get to talking about that in just a little bit. So these wetlands occur along the floodplains of Salt Creek and its tributaries. This is Rock Creek up by Ceresco, an aerial photo. I think Scott Ludke took this aerial. It's looking up Rock Creek across our Jackson Wildlife Management Area. And you can see how the wetlands are associated with the floodplain of the creeks. And so they're not located in the hills. They're all down along in the alluvial valleys of these streams. And what makes them saline wetlands is they have salt in their wetlands. So that makes them a saline wetland. The salts come up to the surface as shown here. And so you get this salt crust that can form. And it's common table salt basically that comes up to the surface through groundwater, evaporates, and you can get this salt crust, which also drives the unique biology of the system. So these salts come from groundwater that's under pressure, under artesian pressure. So if you put a well down, you will get free-flowing wells in that saline aquifer. This is a wonderful diagram that was in the Success in the Salt Marsh Nebraska Land article. Tim Reichert, our artist at Nebraska Land put this cross section together that shows kind of how these saline wetlands occupy these alluvial valleys along the floodplains, and the water comes up, the groundwater under pressure comes up and forms saline meadows, salt flats, and salt marshes. And so I'll talk just a little bit more about how that works. This is not a saline wetland, and it's not in Nebraska. This is the Rocky Mountains, and you might say, well, what do the Rocky Mountains have to do with saline wetlands? Well, actually, when you talk hydrologically, we recognize quite well that surface waters are connected. So the waters in the Rockies that form the Platte River flow as surface water across Nebraska. But there's also recharge zones of the groundwater in the Front Range of the Rockies. And studies by hydrologists have shown that the water that feeds our saline wetlands actually recharges along the Front Range of the Rockies, where the bedrock underlying Lancaster and Saunders County comes to the surface out in the Rockies. And this is a cross section from Goslin. And so Goslin and Ed Harvey and others at UNL have done a lot of work on the hydrology and geology of this system. I won't go into it in detail, but it's a cross section showing from the Rockies to the plains. And so water moves along through these bedrock formations, picks up salts in these marine shales. A lot of it's in Kansas, and then it moves up into Nebraska. It gets under pressure. It hits a barrier, gets under pressure, and rises to the surface in the stream valleys. And that's what causes our saline wetlands to form. So you get this salt crust. Again, it's table salt. Sodium chloride is the main element. There's other elements in that salt, in those salts as well. So this is one of those salty crusts that forms in the saline wetlands. So let's shift and talk about the history of the saline wetlands. We know they were important to the Native Americans that lived in these landscapes, and there are some records of their using these saline wetlands not only for salt but also for the game species that were attracted to these saline wetlands and the associated streams. I love this quote from William Clark from the Journal. When Lewis and Clark came up the Missouri, they also came up the Platte River a little ways, explored that. They came to an area I have underlined here. They say a small river comes into the Platte called Salt River. The water's so brackish that it can't be drank at some seasons. So even Lewis and Clark in their expedition in 1804 noticed that Salt Creek was brackish, carrying salts into the Platte River. And so it's kind of an amazing perspective there from the Lewis and Clark expedition. This is a great quote here. I won't go into all the details, but one of the earlier settlers, this is from 1861, earlier settlers in the Lincoln area, W.W. Cox, talked about coming upon the area that became Lincoln. And I love how he describes a drove of antelope and also the sunflowers, and how the morning breezes across the saline wetlands reminded him of an ocean breeze that he was familiar with. So some neat history there from the early settlers. And this is also an early settlement in Lincoln, where Lincoln now stands, an old sod house from probably the mid 1800s. So this land was settled around Lincoln. We associate Lincoln with the university and the state capitol and all the modern amenities, but Lincoln was actually founded where it is because of Salt Creek and because of the saline wetlands. And a lot of people aren't well aware of that history. So if we talk about the saline wetlands and the history, there was salt was a very, we don't associate salt as a valuable commodity these days, but salt was a very rare commodity back in the 1800s, a valuable commodity. And so a lot of salt extraction industry got set up in Lincoln, again, the source of the founding of the city. And so from the 1860s to the 1890s, some years they were taking hundreds of thousands of pounds of salt out of the saline wetlands and exporting it, because salt was needed for food preservation back before we had refrigeration. A lot of people are familiar with J. Sterling Morton of Morton Salt. We think of him as a founder of Arbor Day, but he also was one of the earlier, the Morton family settled in the Lincoln area and were involved in the salt extraction in the 1800s. So kind of an interesting historical aspect on Lincoln and the salts. I love this photo from the Barber collection at the UNL Digital Commons. This is showing Salt Creek in 1902. looking towards Lincoln, looking east towards Lincoln. And so it's just amazing to me. First, no trees, it's a prairie landscape. And also, if you're familiar with Salt Creek now, how it's ditched and degraded, you can see Salt Creek up near the surface and not highly in size. So a pretty amazing photo from 1902. Well, the saline industry collapsed because salt was discovered in Kansas and other underground sources. It was much more economically viable to harvest it there. So the saline extraction, salt extraction industry collapsed in Lincoln. But they turned some of this, an area called the Salt Lake, what is now Capitol Beach Lake, also was known as Burlington Beach, into an amusement park. A lot of people aren't aware of that history. So it was kind of the predecessor to Oceans of Fun, I guess you could say. So you had this amazing theme park with roller coasters and saline baths, and it was quite a popular attraction. Burlington Northern actually put a railroad spur up to it so people could take the train and visit the saline wetlands in the Salt Lake. Well, again, as that collapsed and as the saline mining collapsed, Lincoln grew. It was established and grew rapidly. And the Salt Creek became, instead of an asset, became a problem. Salt Creek flooding, Salt Creek, they needed a place for the sewage water to get out of town quicker. And so throughout the 1900s, there were lots of efforts to channelize and put berms along Salt Creek to move the water out faster and to protect the growing city from flooding. So this is a photo from 1941 of some of the channelization work along Salt Creek. What that resulted in is a channelized Salt Creek that we're familiar with that flows through Lincoln today. So instead of a meandering stream, it's a straight ditch basically with levees on the side that protect it. And they work to protect the land, the city from flooding, but it's also greatly altered the saline wetlands. We get down cutting. The stream is cut down deeper. The photo in the upper right is Randy Studheit standing in Little Salt Creek. It's highly incised now. So the saline waters are not coming up to the surface as they historically did. And that also leads to head cutting. The bottom photo shows some head cuts that form as these streams incise. Those head cuts work their way up into the wetlands and further drain and alter those wetlands. In addition, the city of Lincoln rapidly grew and grew right over many of our saline wetlands. We have a photo here of Hobson Rail Yard. A lot of saline wetlands were covered up when the rail yard was put in. In addition, the bottom right is actually a wetland assessment project we're working on. That was the assessing a buffer to a saline wetland. Well, you can look at that and say, well, it's a parking lot, an apartment complex, not a real high quality buffer from a natural standpoint or providing wildlife habitat. And that urban development greatly alters how those wetlands function. They get more fresh water, more pollutants, and causes an alteration of that historic system. So we estimate that somewhere around 90% of the wetlands have either been totally destroyed or are highly, highly degraded. So this also shows that well. This is the photo on the left is an aerial from 1955. The area we're showing here is the interchange with 27th Street and I-80. On the right is a modern photo of that area, as you are probably familiar with it if you've been to Lincoln or from Lincoln. It's a busy interchange, lots of development, lots of housing. You can see how greatly that landscape's changed from a meandering stream with a lot of saline wetlands and salt crust to a much more developed landscape today with the interstate exchange that was put in up there in the early 1990s. In addition, we deal with a lot of invasive species on the saline wetlands. So not only has the hydrologic system been altered, but we have invasives like hybrid cattail, reed canary grass, which are pictured here, and also Phragmites as a growing problem. So lots of stuff we deal with, but we still have some amazing resources out there, and we'll be talking about that in some of the other talks. So here on the left is some saltwort, Salicornia, a state endangered plant. And on the right is a salt flat with some Sueda or sea blythe with saltgrass. So showing some of these still intact wetlands that still function and provide a lot of biological benefit. Obviously, one of those species that benefits is the Salt Creek tiger beetle, and Steve Spomer and others are going to be talking about that in their presentations today. So I'm not going to get into the details on the Salt Creek tiger beetle, but it is one of the endemic species of our saline wetlands that use this unique habitat. And we have 37 tier 1 and tier 2 species that potentially could use the saline wetland BUL. Probably about 10 of those are regular users of the saline wetlands. And so from a biological biodiversity conservation perspective, these saline wetlands are highly important. They're also recognized historically and currently as very important for a lot of different bird species, including waterfowl and shorebirds. They're well known for the habitats that they provide for those species, but also they provide a habitat for numerous other species. So we always like to emphasize that conservation of saline wetlands is not just about the Salt Creek tiger beetle, but about the whole suite of biological species that use these habitats. And a credit here to Mike Forsberg. Mike worked on the Success in the Salt Marsh article in Nebraska Land, and these are all his photos. And I should say any of the good photos here are either Mike's or from Nebraska Land magazine. If they're kind of blurry, poor photos are probably ones that I took. So we're blessed with being able to use these amazing photos from some very talented photographers.
3 minutes, Ted.
Thank you. And in addition, these saline wetlands are used and provide a lot of other benefits for green space, for recreation. The ones further out from the city still provide hunting opportunities. And they're also important for flood control. The lower right photo is after the 2015 flood, showing the Whitehead wetland and the importance. A lot of acre feet of water being stored on those floodplains if we leave them intact and let those wetlands function there. So shift now and talk about conservation. The early conservation was about documenting the saline wetlands, how they functioned, and some of the species that use them. This is a great photo of Frank Shoemaker from the early 1900s, one of the first people to describe the presence of a variety of the different tiger beetles out on the saline wetlands, and shows a really neat saline flat there. And in more contemporary times, especially the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of mapping and work done on saline wetlands. People like Jerry Steinauer, Dick Gersib, who's my predecessor, Randy Studheit, heavily involved in that and worked to describe these wetlands, to map the wetlands, and that was a great achievement. But the battles continued mostly in the regulatory front. Before the Salt Creek tiger beetle was listed, there were lots of battles, and I was involved with them early on when I came out here in 1993. Seems like we were constantly battling development pressure on these saline wetlands. The lower right here shows where Home Depot is located now on Cornhusker and 27th Street. That was a Kmart when I moved to Lincoln, and the Kmart had just been built on top of a saline wetland. And there was almost no development north of Cornhusker when I came to Lincoln in 1993. So all that development up the Salt Creek Valley has happened since the interstate interchange opened in the early 90s. So some amazing things happen. The city of Lincoln and Lancaster County give huge credit to them for coming up with the Green Print Challenge and the comprehensive plan that recognize the importance of saline wetlands, the importance of endangered species, and shifted development pressure away from where some of these most important habitats were. In addition, in the early 90s, or in the early 2000s, 2003, the Saline Wetlands Conservation Partnership was formed. And we have this slide here showing a couple of the implementation plans, including the lower right, the more recent one, the original partners up in the upper right, and then the new and improved team on the lower left of the Saline Wetland Conservation Partnership. Won't go into details here because Tom Malmstrom's going to cover that, but Tom's pictured there along with Dan Schultz, Kelsey Weirman from Pheasants Forever, myself, and then Nicole Flectus from the city of Lincoln. And they've accomplished a lot of great work. This is from the Success in the Salt Marsh, showing the conservation properties that have been put in place along Little Salt Creek, Rock Creek, and Salt Creek. And the ones in green here have been accomplished since the Saline Conservation Partnership was established. So I'd like to end with this photo showing Jackson Wildlife Management Area along Rock Creek, pre-restoration and post-restoration. So we've done a lot of land conservation work. We've done a lot of restoration work. These areas require a lot of ongoing management. And I will say, I think we've accomplished a lot, but in addition, there's a lot we don't know about this system, the hydrology and the biology. And so there's a lot of ongoing work to document and to try to better understand how this system functions and how we can move forward with ensuring the restoration and conservation of these unique saline wetlands. So with that, that's my contact information. And thank you for your attention and participation. And Sean, if there's time, if there's any questions, be happy to try to answer those.